right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Library and the VC's Reading Group. It's wonderful to be starting another year of VC's Reading Groups. And at the University of Johannesburg, we are truly fortunate to have such a scholarly Vice Chancellor, somebody who reads across so many different disciplines. And today we're going to be dipping into the discipline of sociology and in some ways the sociology of religion. We're looking at Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Just to give you a little bit of context to this book, it was written at the beginning of the 20th century and comes at the beginning and formation of three different disciplines: psychology, sociology, and anthropology. Until the 1800s, religion had been studied theologically, and people didn't really think about studying religions in any other way. And then, of course, we have the famous Das Kapital from Karl Marx, where he looks at religion and begins to look at the social impact of religious hegemonies. And this then leads to different people by the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century to look more critically at religions. So we have Freud looking at religion from the perspective of individual people and how religious taboos affect us psychologically. And then we have Durkheim looking at religion from an anthropological perspective and arguing that in small societies, religion is used as a way to hold societies together and make them cohesive around one idea or one God. And Weber takes a different stance. He looks at religion and the broader social effects of religion. And he writes this book looking at Northern Europe and really asking the question, why was Northern Europe so different to the South? And in some ways, why was Northern Europe becoming more capitalistic than Southern Europe? And he makes this argument that religions, even when they are no longer practiced, many of their ideas begin to become imbued as part of the way people understand themselves and the way people see the world. And that's very much his argument here in The Protestant Ethic. He is saying that the ideas of Protestantism shape Northern Europe. And he was suggesting that by the end of the 20th century, religion would have died out, but many of the ideas of how we behave would continue to be influenced by religious ideas, even when people were no longer practicing their faith. The Protestant ethic has been studied by many people over the last century, and has in the 1990s and early 2000s been at the center of debates around Pentecostalism in Africa. So it is very interesting to be looking at this book at the beginning of the 21st century. And Prof. Marwala, we are very excited to hear your ideas and your take on this particular book. Over to you.
No, thank you very much, Maria, for that introduction. Firstly, I would like to put it up front that I am a conflicted party here. I was brought up in the Protestant church. In fact, I was baptized when I was few days old as a Lutheran. The very person, Martin Luther, was the very person who started the Protestant movement. Of course, recently I reread a book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by Max Weber. Weber wrote this book as a critic of Karl Marx, who posited the causal relationship between the substructure, which he called the base, and the superstructure. The substructure is the means and relations of economic production. This means, the means of economic production include the instruments used to produce goods and services such as tractors, computers. The relations of economic production include owners of instruments, the company's investors, and their relationship to labor. The fourth industrial revolution, of course, is reducing the role of labor in economic production by replacing it with intelligent and automated machines. In contrast, the superstructure is everything not directly linked to economic production, such as politics, culture, education, and of course, religion. In this regard, the means and relations of production that emerge. On the other hand, culture and politics also influence the nature of economic production. In this book, Weber describes how religion, a superstructure, affects the means and relations of economic production. The type of religion that Weber considers is the Protestant religion. I think Weber really tried very hard to be a critic of Marx, because as we all know, Marx obviously studied how the economic relations between the working class actually influenced the superstructure, but he also spent quite a great deal of time thinking about how the superstructure can influence the base. In fact, in this regard, Marx is quoted as saying that philosophers in various times have interpreted the world. The point is really to change it, which means how do you design a superstructure that is going to create a base or substructure? Now, what is this thing called the Protestant religion? When Emperor Constantine converted the Roman Empire to Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church became the dominant force in the Roman Empire. The Pope, he became wealthy and powerful, with all the monarchs of Europe needing his blessing to hold on to their throne. The Eastern Roman Empire fell to the Muslims of Constantinople, today called Istanbul. In the Western Roman Empire in the 1500s, the Catholic monk Martin Luther broke from the church. He started the Protestant movement when he publicized a list of 95 church malpractices he was protesting against and which he considered corrupt. He translated the Bible to German, which was only read in Latin by the clergy in Western Europe up to that time. In the process, he formed the standard German language as written and spoken today and changed the German culture considerably. Others, such as John Calvin, followed suit in the French-speaking parts of Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands. This led to the establishment of the Dutch Reformed Church, which has a significant following in South Africa due to Dutch and French settlement after 1652. Of course, the French people in South Africa came from the French Huguenots, and that is why amongst our African compatriots, you have quite a great deal of French last name, such as Marais, such as de Klerk, such as Leroux, Lubaskakny, and many others, Duplessis. So King Henry the Eighth had initially written a book against Martin Luther, but soon came out against in the 1530s when the Pope would not nullify his marriage. Protestantism on its subjects, in addition to seizing and distributing church property, Protestant kings subjects released conflicts established themselves in colonial outposts. The conflict between the Protestants and Catholics continues up to today in Northern Ireland, despite the so-called the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. The stalemate between Britain and the European Union over Brexit is because of the Protestant Catholic conflict in Northern Ireland. This movement was called the Protestant because it was protesting against the excesses of the Catholic Church. Many churches came out of the Protestant movement, and this includes Lutherans, which is a denomination that I was brought up in, Presbyterians, Calvinists, and Methodists. A particular form of Protestantism is what is called the Puritans. And I have to talk about the Puritans because they became very influential in North America. In England, when England became the first country in Europe to abolish the monarchy, it was because of this fight between Catholicism and Protestant religion. Of course, many people will not know that England abolished the monarchy and they killed their king, Charles I. It was only later, after more than a decade, that the English went back to monarchy. So this idea of Protestantism has actually changed Europe in more ways than we can understand. Now, what is the difference between the Protestant tradition and the Catholic tradition? While the Catholic Church was grand, from the Presbyterians, the Protestant churches were frugal. And of course, if you visit, especially many cities in the world, especially in the Western world, you will find that some of the most impressive structures are actually Catholic cathedrals. Because in Catholic Church, the idea of being grand, of building structures that were impressive, is part of their culture. While in Catholicism, the priesthood was an economic class that was dominant. In the Lutheran Church, every Christian was a priest, and thus ushering the culture of individualism. For the Lutherans, all work, and not just the clergy, was good and was not a punishment from God. This, of course, ushered the Protestant culture of pride in all work. From the Calvinists, the concept of predestination, where some people are chosen and written in the book of life, made people work hard to prove that they are the chosen people. Of course, you see this culture amongst the Afrikaners in South Africa. The Methodists came with the idea that being methodical and organized makes you closer to God. According to Weber, these attributes of the Protestant churches, individualism, pride in one's work, being organized, and I will add another one, actually staying away from superstition, established capitalism as we see it today. It is these characteristics that Weber called the Protestant ethic. Consequently, the Protestant countries in Europe became wealthier than the Catholic countries. This trend continues up to today. Predominantly Protestant United States of America and Canada are more affluent than Catholic Brazil and Argentina. Largely Protestant Sweden and Germany are wealthier than the Catholic Portugal and Spain. Weber's work's profound aspect is to show that religion, a superstructure, has a profound effect on the economic activities of individuals, a substructure. While Europe and particular sections of North America are increasingly secularizing, the Protestant ethic culture remains intact, even in people of other faiths. This explains why Elon Musk, even though he is the second richest man globally, still works for more than 18 hours a day. This is because, in accordance to the Protestant ethic, work is glorious. This explains why the dress codes of Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg are not adorned in gold and diamond as they are in the trinkets of Queen Elizabeth and Pope Francis. This is because frugality is glorious according to the Protestant culture. It explains why Hollywood stars go to third world countries to adopt and work in poor neighborhoods. This is because all work is good and being conscientious is glorious. According to Weber, the Protestant ethic preserves wealth and does not spend it on frivolous activities. And this is why it tends to lead to capital formation, leading to the increase in wealth. Now, coming to the African continent, can we use religion as a motive force for economic development? Of the 1.3 billion Africans in the continent, 49% are Christians and 42% are Muslims. Has not taken the antagonistic routes as they did in Europe. I also need to put it up front that Christianity was in Africa before it was in Western Europe. In fact, the founder of the Christian faith, Jesus Christ, was a political refugee in Egypt when he was a child. He had to run away from the wrath of King Herod's jealousy. Ethiopia was the first country to adopt Christianity as a state religion almost 2,000 years ago. It happened in the 1st century AD, more than 300 years before the conversion of the Roman Empire into Christianity, and thereby leading to the spread of Christianity into the Western world. During colonial times, classical Protestant churches such as Lutherans and Methodists took root to a limited extent. However, because colonization was exploitative rather than developmental, they never had the desire, nor scale, nor resources to implant Protestant ethic in the African continent. Despite these limitations, most of the anti-colonial revolutionaries, such as John Langalibalele Dube and Saul Plaatje, came from the Protestant tradition. For example, we know that Saul Plaatje was brought up in the West Paarl family, who were Lutheran preachers in the Northern Cape. Much of the growth of contemporary Christianity in Africa is prosperity Christianity. Prosperity Christians, who are mostly evangelical, believe that God gives financial and physical well-being. Therefore, if you pray hard enough, then you shall be rewarded with financial and physical health. More than any other sect, prosperity Christianity represents the adage of Karl Marx that religion is the opium of the masses. While in classical Protestant Christianity, hard work, frugality, individualism, pride in one's work, and being organized are essential characteristics. In prosperity Christianity, showmanship, opulence, and miracles are crucial characteristics. To illustrate this point, consider the American evangelist Kenneth Copeland, who called people, and I quote, a bunch of demons to justify his use of private jets. Here in our own backyard, Prophet Bushiri, a fugitive from South Africa, is known for his miracles and opulence, and not for his frugality and honest work from the Protestant ethic. In trying to answer the central theme of my talk today, can Christianity, as a very big force in the African continent, be used to economically develop Africa the same way it was used to develop Northern Europe? Can the rising evangelical Christianity be directed towards reality, working hard, pride in one's work, and being organized as developmental tools? Unfortunately, the DNA of prosperity theology is populism, promises of success and miracles. Suppose evangelical Christianity was to turn against these attributes and adopt the Protestant ethic. In that case, it will lose its appeal and face the faiths that have become emptier and emptier. Given all this, what is to be done? We need to adopt economic development and not religious ones. We need to create a strong state that can actively direct the development of society, and such a state must not be corrupt, and the anti-corruption of such a state can be the Protestant ethic. China is an excellent example of how a strong government can develop a nation and decrease poverty, unemployment, and inequality without leaning on religion. These principles of hard work, pride in work, frugality, and organizational capacity are actually found in many cultures in Africa and in Asia, and must be embedded in all superstructures of our society, such as in our politics, culture, media, and education. Furthermore, given that we are in the era of the fourth industrial revolution, technology must be included as part of the ethic of development. Thank you very much.
Marwala, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to kick off the questions by collating a few questions around the Marx and Weber debate. So for Karl Marx, religion was the hegemony of the working classes. They were told that it was divinely inspired, that the working classes should be poor and that few should be wealthy. And according to Marx, this hegemony was like a balm or an opium. It helped people cope with their oppression, giving them the hope that they would live a better life in heaven. And it helped to justify their oppression and for them not to question that oppression. As you've been describing just now, Weber's central thesis was actually radically different. He argued that religion, particularly Puritan forms of Protestantism, actually helped people move out of the working class and created the middle class. Varying different scholars have used both Weber or Marx to understand Africa, and there have been heated debates on both sides. The questions that are coming in through the chat are, what role do you think religion is playing in Africa at the moment, and which either Weber or Marx help us better understand the role of religion in Africa?
No, thank you very much. Obviously, I will be quite controversial here. The role that religion is playing in Africa is not developmental. I'll give you an example. The Catholic Church, with all its faults, and we know many of its faults, especially before the Reformation, of popes ensuring that their relatives are appointed in higher positions in churches. What people do not know is that even up to today, at the University of Cambridge and the University of Oxford, the highest qualification is not a PhD. It is religious roles. We all know that education came to Western Europe through religion. The idea of reading and writing in Britannia, which is now called Britain, actually came through Christianity, through the Roman Empire. We know that here in the African continent, many of our languages became written languages the same way as it was in Europe because of religion. So it was playing a developmental role. Now, let us ask ourselves a hard question. If we look at religion today, if we look at Christianity, and I talk in particular prosperity Christianity, is it building schools? Is it building universities? Is it at the center of the war against poverty, inequality, and unemployment? I don't think so. I think what ought to happen in Africa is that religion must more and more play a developmental agenda. It should be at the forefront of digital literacy in our community. It should be at the forefront of restoring the ethic of our people so that the sort of crimes that we are seeing in our communities simply do not happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Marwala. I'm sorry, I'm going to take a moment as a sociologist of religion who studies Pentecostal churches closely and make two comments. The first is I think we need to be a bit careful when we talk about Christianity. There isn't really one Christianity. It's possibly easier to talk about Christianities. And then within the prosperity gospel, there are definitely churches like Grace Bible Church and All Nations that do an enormous amount of work to uplift people. And they definitely have a very strong ethic of hard work. These are the sort of churches started in the late 1970s, early 1980s. But we now have a brand of Pentecostal Christianity, which many of us refer to as Prophetic Pentecostalism, which is the sort of shepherd bushiri type of Christianity, which is just incredibly opulent. And this prosperity gospel is a gospel of praying for miracles. So you don't work, you just pray. You drink petrol in the hope that God is going to see your faithfulness and give you prosperity. So there are different types of Christianity, and I think we need to just be a little bit careful before we paint everything with one brush. But the point you make about development is incredibly important. And for Weber, one of his ideas with development was the bureaucratization that particularly Protestantism brought about. You alluded to it with the Methodist Church. And so some of the questions in the chat are around Weber's famous quote of the golden cage. So this idea that we would create these bureaucratic systems and structures, and they would almost be like a golden cage that would hem us in. Would you like to make any comments about bureaucracy perhaps in Africa, and the idea of the golden cage that Weber talks about?
Well, I mean, I think especially in a democratic country like ourselves, bureaucracy is very, very important. Why is it important in a country like ourselves? It is because in an elective, the so-called liberal democracy, where every 5 years the political class are replaced, simply because you are going to have an election every 5 years. In a liberal democratic society where elections happen and members of parliament are changed, you must have something that is able to sustain a country over a longer period than a 5-year cycle. I think bureaucracy is such an institution. Now, it's not just bureaucracy, it has to be bureaucracy that works. So basically, the bureaucracy is important because as the political class renew itself, you need something that is going to allow for long-term planning. But bureaucracy becomes even more important if it is the one that is based on expertise. So they have to. Our bureaucracy must be able to understand its task and must be competent to be able to execute such a task. If that bureaucracy has good work ethic means if your responsibility is to look after whatever you are looking for, after whether it is assets or whether it's to help people, you do that job with the best of your ability. Whatever the job is, you must be proud of executing it and executing it well. So the role of bureaucracy in the African continent cannot be emphasized enough. I think the question that we ought to ask ourselves is, have we created a bureaucratic structure in our governments that is able to meet the goals of our people? And the answer is mixed. And when you go to the rest of the African continent, the answer is no. I think one of the best bureaucracy is what I see when I go to Japan. And Japan, if you look at the number of prime ministers that they have had in the last 50 years, it's more than 50. But the government somehow is stable. Why? Because they have a stable, reliable, hardworking, bureaucratic layer. So we need to create that in the African continent. And the bureaucratic layer is not going to be created in the absence of our educational institutions. Our universities must play a big part in developing a bureaucracy that works hard and has good work ethics.
Thank you very much for that, Prof. Marwala. There are two things that come out from what you've just said. The first was what we were talking about a little bit before we went live, and that is the idea that there are other religions that also develop ideas of hard work. And when you were talking about Japan and you look at Zen Buddhism that is so dominant in Japan, one of the key things about Buddhism is order, structure, hard work, and being present all the time to what you are doing. And that leads very well into a number of questions on the chat, which is about African traditional religions. And if I sum up these questions, what people are asking is, should we not be looking rather at African traditional religions to develop ideas of hard work and dedication?
No, absolutely. I completely agree with that. You know, I'm a big believer in African tradition. I think yes, my attitude towards work was probably shaped by me being brought up as a Lutheran. But in many ways, it was shaped by the traditional structures that I inherited, that was around me in the community. So, I mean, the reason why we are focusing on the Protestant religion is not because it is the only mode in which you can be able to construct a developmentally orientated society. It is simply because today we are analyzing a book about the Protestant ethic. Otherwise, the African religions have done fantastic work that we can learn from.
There have been some very interesting questions from all of you. One of them is around the idea of reconciling decolonialization and the embrace of Protestantism. And I think that's perhaps something for all of us to think about. So actually, the next question that I'm going to ask you was, you were talking about China in your talk, and that has led a couple of people to ask, but what about Chinese sweatshops? So while Chinese people can be heralded for being hardworking, some of the conditions are not ideal.
No, absolutely. I mean, I will agree with you that some of the sweatshops, sweatshops are certainly not something that we should advocate. But that is a topic of another debate, which is really how much hard work is hard work. How about exploitation? And that's where Marx actually comes in. Marx spent quite a great deal constructing or thinking about the construction of a superstructure that is going to eliminate exploitation. Whether he was successful or not is a question that many people debate about. But if you go to the West, they will tell you that, yes, maybe exploitation and inequality was not high in socialist countries, but what happened to production? What happened to wealth creation? And so on and so forth. So those are valid issues that I think we should be reflecting on. When we construct our own developmental trajectory, we have to base it on the principles of fairness, the principles of ensuring that exploitation is not part of that developmental agenda.
Thank you very much, Prof. Marwala. The next question is very focused on the book that we're looking at. And you are asked, what warning does Weber provide as he concludes his text?
Well, I mean, obviously, I just need to put it up front that in many ways, Weber wrote this book as a critic of Marx. And he does go out of the way to go in that direction, and maybe to also pick up on what you said at the beginning before we started this talk, that Weber actually thought at this stage religion is not going to play a significant part in many people's countries. If you look at the United States, religion is very much part of their of their culture. It is very much part of their politics. In fact, the religious voice in American politics, especially the evangelical voice, is actually much more pronounced today than maybe during the time at which Weber anticipated it. My warning, not Weber's warning, is that as we use some of these principles, let us separate the role of the state from the role of religion. The separation of of church and state principle is actually very, very important, especially in our country, especially as we move forward as a society.
So, Prof. Marwala, you've actually just answered one of the other themes that are coming through. Students asking if you could say more about the separation of church and state. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add to that.
I think the separation of church and state is sacrosanct. I think there is a role of the church in our society. There is a role of the state in our society. The state is given its power, according to Rousseau, J.J. Rousseau, is given its power by the people in an electoral system in exchange for the state to perform certain tasks, and the electorate must actually hold the elected officials to account if whatever they have promised to do is not done. Whereas the issues of the church is the matter of the faith, and the matter of the faith are individual matters, even within families. You can have people who have completely different religious views. And as a democratic country, we have to respect all those views. And we have to make sure that all those views are protected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it's one of the interesting things about the Protestant ethic, because, Protestantism was, as you said earlier, on a separation of church and state. And the only Protestant church that had a combined church and state was the Church of England. And that's actually the only Protestant church. So not the whole Anglican Communion, just the Church of England. And all other Protestant churches were a strong separation of church and state, which is not what you'd seen in the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church was deeply infused with the states and kingdoms in different ways.
Maybe just to talk, maybe if I could just talk about the Church of England, because the Church of England was a very controversial church within the Protestant movement.
Exactly.
And obviously its own formation was controversial, because it was formed because the king wanted to divorce his wife so that he could marry another wife. And the Pope said, and the Pope said no, and then he basically declared all the Catholic churches in England the Church of England. That's what he did. And in many ways, if you go to an Anglican church, even today, it probably more than any other church that I've ever seen looks the most to the Roman Catholic Church. The practices, the little things that they do inside, they look quite identical. And it was precisely because of that the Puritans emerged, because the Puritans were basically saying that this reformation of the Church of England is not really real reformation, and they call themselves Puritans because they want to purify the Church of England from the vestiges of the Catholic Church. And by the way, there's nothing, I hold no views about this. I am just explaining history as I understand it. Yeah.
The next question is around how do we reconcile decolonialization with the embrace of Protestantism?
Well, I mean, if there is one church that originates in Europe, it is actually Protestant church, because Christianity is not a European concept. I even said it initially that it was in Africa before it was in England, before it was in Germany. I even indicated that Jesus Christ was a political refugee in Egypt, and that the Ethiopian church that still exists today, and if you go to Ethiopia, you should go and visit their churches, because these are not churches that were built yesterday. They were built more than 1,000 years ago. Ethiopia was the first country to convert to Christianity in the 1st century AD. it's almost 300 years before the Roman Empire adopted Christianity. Now, coming back to the issue of decolonization, I think colonization, what I would say is that in the era in which we live in, the so-called Protestant ethic have actually become, secular ideas. They become secular ideas. These concepts of frugality, being proud of your work, working hard, staying away from superstition, family is less important than community, are in many ways good ideas in organizing society. So I wouldn't actually, yes, Weber calls them a Protestant ethic. I would say many of them have become mainstream ideas. And I've also said that many of these ideas were already in our culture. Even before the Protestant religion came into being, the idea of working hard. So I wouldn't actually be too concerned that this Protestant ethic are actually, attributes that are Protestant. No, they are not. They were in Asia, they were in Africa before the Protestant church actually adopted them.
Thank you for that. And one of the people in the chat has also been pointing out that these same ethics can be found in Islam. The next set of questions, not surprisingly, are around 4IR. And so there are people asking, what do you think is the future of religion in the 21st century and in the age of 4IR?
Look, I mean, it is actually quite evident that the more you understand science, the more you understand many of the attributes of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the less religious many people become. In fact, the United States is an outlier. If you look at all countries at that level at that stage of development, United States, the European Union, Japan, and China, you will realize that as they moved up into the prosperity value chain, they have become less religious. They have become less religious. And in fact, when you look at the United States, which is at that level of development, you will realize that the degree of religiosity is similar to those of countries that have not reached that stage of development. This basically means, in short, it is very difficult to predict what is going to happen. If United States was not there, I would say that the more prosperous people become, the less religious people are there. But in many ways, United States actually debunk that thesis. So it is much more complicated than that. I think you are going to see mixed. You're going to have a certain amount of people that are going to turn away from religion, and then you're going to see other people actually going for religion. This must be controversial. I think the reason why Europe has become less religious is because of the world wars. The horrors of the world wars have made people question supernatural things that they thought were going to protect them. And of course, that did not happen. And the Second World War came, and over 25 million people perished in that war.
Yeah, and there's a lot of evidence for that theory, and you see it in the tremendous decline in theological colleges and people going to study theology in Europe post the Second World War. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens after COVID and the effect that COVID is going to have on people's religiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Prof. Marwala, we are coming to the end of our time together, and I wonder if you would like to just wrap up the conversation, and if you have any concluding remarks or ideas that you'd like to share with us.
No. Thank you very much for coming. I think this is probably one of the most difficult topics. The idea of linking religion to economics, I think it is something that was first done by Marx, by Weber. But of course, as I was reading a book on religion and capitalism by Friedman, you were saying that even scholars like Hume, like Adam Smith, were actually much more influenced by religion than we actually realize. This is a very difficult topic, but this is a topic that we in the African continent must play a prominent role. Why should we play a prominent role? It is because religion is a very much important part of the contemporary African life. Christianity is growing in the African continent faster than it is growing in any other part of the world. And therefore, it is something that we ought to be able to understand. So please come next month for the next book that I am going to be reading. And the book that I am going to be reading is The 12 Who Ruled.
12 Who Ruled.
Yeah.
Sounds fascinating.
These are the members of the Committee of Public Safety during the time of the French Revolution.
So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm also just going to punt Professor Marwala's and my favorite shop, Exclusive Books. If you found anything that Prof. Marwala was saying interesting today, there is a book that's just come out by Kate Moss. It's called The City of Angels, and she tells the story of the Huguenots in their break from the Catholic Church, and she looks at Amsterdam and Paris and Southern Africa. So if any of this was interesting to you, then as a novel, go and read Kate Moss's The City of Angels, and we will probably see you at Exclusive Books, where Prof. Marwala and I both like to hang out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. We so look forward to seeing you again next month. And Prof. Marwala, once again, thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us, to prepare such a thoughtful presentation, and to help us all think more critically about the world in which we live, which is really the most important job we have here in the Academy. To everybody, stay well and stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you in a few weeks' time.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.